Well, thank you for joining us on this Thursday afternoon for the last of our P2 webinars before the summer break. We're going to go offline for August, and a bit of a special one today. We've focused on a lot of different things over the last 3 or 4 months, and today we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to actually have a look at what might happen in the world of project management going forward over the next 5, 10 years. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is already here, already existing in places. But it's really interesting to have a look at how all that stuff might interact and what it might mean for the role of the project manager, the role of the PMO, transformation in general over the next 5 or 10 years. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about over the next half hour. For those who've not joined us before, my name is Adam Skinner. We'll be talking for about half an hour. We won't unfortunately have time for questions given the short nature of the time, but please do type them in. You can type in questions, and we always do come back and answer them after the event. And of course, you will receive this webinar as an email shortly after the event. So please do feel free to share it with anyone you think would find it interesting. But before we kick off and charge straight into the future, let's have a quick look at what P2 is for those who've not come across before. So for those who've not come across P2 before, we are the digital transformation house that was set up about 7 years ago to provide a real alternative to the Big Four. We've operated over a range of different sectors and spaces, and we continually delight our customers by delivering on our 3 P2 promises. That's to improve, control, and deliver on our clients' transformation ambitions. And we do these things for some of the biggest names in retail and government and the financial sector. Usually we do a deep dive into one of these 12 services you see sitting behind those 3 promises, but today we're going to talk actually a bit more generally about them, and we'll touch on a number of these really important areas as we go forward. For those who've not come across me before, my name's Adam Skinner. I'm P2's Director of Consulting, and I do a range of work with the APM around portfolio management, and really enjoy studying let's call it the underpinnings of transformation, and try and working out what's trending and the like going forward. So without further ado, let's start talking about the future of project management. But I'm a great believer in, to understand where you're going, you do need to understand where you're coming from. So I want to spend a few minutes just looking at the history of project management and what project management's meant over the years. And actually, it's a very, very old profession. You find reference to building an activity around design actually right back in Hammurabi's Code. You know, the first codified series of laws, 1754. If a builder builds a house for a man and does not make its construction firm, and the house which he has built collapses and causes the death of the owner of the house, that builder shall be put to death. Pretty serious findings there, but you know what, we'll come back to that. So just remember the fact that actually back in the day, if you didn't do your build activity correctly, there were some pretty serious punishments for that. Forward to the modern era, and I like to think the beginning of our profession came around in about 1917 with the design of the Gantt chart by Henry Gantt, and that became particularly famous because it was used exclusively to design the Hoover Dam, massive Gantt charts to coordinate this incredibly large industrial project, which was in many ways the main global industrial project of the 30s, the Hoover Dam. As with so many things, the war drove our profession forward quite a lot. And actually, if you look at how it was used on the Manhattan Project and various other really significant military projects, you see the beginnings of a profession, the beginnings of a formalized approach to project management starting to be developed. And that was formalized in the professional body, the American Association of Cost Estimators in 1956, which in my opinion is the first professional body that really took project management, project coordination seriously. And actually that coordinates with the development of PERT and sort of the creation of the sort of the work breakdown structure, again linked to Polaris, but a range of other sort of military endeavors. Similarly, in that period, you see the development of NASA's phase project planning. So NASA developed their own project handbook, which kind of coordinated the ways of delivering change. Interestingly, if you look at PERT and WBS and some of those things. I think of those as tools to help one get better at certain aspects of project management. If you look at what NASA was doing, though, it took a coordinated approach. It's created a phased approach. It was the first time, in my opinion, you started to see a project broken down into serious structured phases with different requirements. If you jump a bit further forward to 1975, you see the development of Prompt 2. And interesting about Prompt 2, that was specifically developed for IT projects. People are starting to see the potential for IT projects, the scale and size of IT projects, and Prompt was a way of trying to codify that. Again, building on the sort of methodologies around PERT and WBS and stuff like the NASA handbook. Jump a bit further forward, 1977, and I arrive. Oh, there we are, looking delightful in like a giant maggot in my outfit there. But probably more importantly for this story, actually, if you jump to the 80s, you start to see the real professionalization. So PMI creates the PMBOK, and of course Prince comes along, and you kind of get to what I think of as the modern era of project management. Now, look, there's something really interesting that happened here, and actually I wasn't really aware of this until a few years ago, but actually in 1986, Scrum came along. Now, I don't know about you, but actually I tend to think of Scrum as an Agile as a relatively modern way of delivering change, but it certainly isn't. You know, you can jump back to 86 with this article, The New Product Development Game, in the Harvard Business Review, and they're essentially saying actually the NASA linear approach is fine, but it does not give you the speed and flexibility you need to meet modern product needs, product being sort of the customer facing aspect. So really interesting, you're looking at sort of something like Scrum, which of course the forefather of Agile, was around good 40 odd years ago. But let's ignore that for the second because it breaks my lovely narrative. And if you move forward to 1996, you've got Prince 2. So you look at the past century and you've got quite a steady trump along of the development of sort of a linear approach to change. And when I think about that, when I think about what change management was trying to do in the past century, I think of change management as an extension of engineering. You see it's kind of it's grounding in sort of the Hoover Dam, the Manhattan Project, and NASA and so on and so forth. What that essentially means is change was treated like a complicated problem. Essentially, there's a lots of moving parts, but you can kind of see the end point at the beginning, as long as you are essentially bright enough. It's a solution is reductionist. I can break this thing into very small parts, and mechanistic, I can put that all back together to get a solution that works for whoever's asking for it. In many ways, what change management was trying to do in the past century was build widget A better. You've asked for something, I'm going to try and build that as cost effectively and efficiently as I possibly can. Something really interesting started happening though about 20 years ago. And it started happening with the development of some really interesting new methodologies. So you jump back to 99 and MSP, Managing Successful Programs, comes on the scenes. And that's trying to do something slightly different to the project management. It was essentially saying, okay, great, you've built widget A, but is widget A really what our stakeholders want? And program management, as I'm sure many of the people in this call will be aware, is essentially about trying to make sure that what you are building is tied into the value that your stakeholders want to get out of what you're building. So it's no longer good enough just to be widget A. You have to build widget A that the stakeholders want. Jump 10 years later, 2011, management of portfolios, an area I'm hugely excited and interested about. And what does management of portfolios try to do? Well, management of portfolios' focus was, again, not specifically about widget A, but very much about how do you align the building of widget A with organizational strategy? What is the value that this organization is trying to generate in the wider world? How do we build stuff that aligns with that organizational value? So stakeholder value coming out of management successful programs, organizational strategic alignment coming out of management of portfolio. And of course, I couldn't do this section without talking about the Agile Manifesto, which came along in 2001. And I like to think of the Agile Manifesto as the thing that sort of started to codify a lot of the thinking around, let's call them agile ways of working, for want of a better term. Now, there's a lot that Agile tries to do, but I tend to think of its primary goal is trying to allow us to make decisions faster. What do I mean by that? Well, actually, Agile is supposed to be embracing change. It's supposed to be making sure that what we're building is much more aligned to the customer need. It's essentially helping us make decisions over what should be built, how we should change it, and how we can align it better to the customer quicker than traditional waterfall methods. So 3 really interesting things that happened in the last 20 years, all focused on value, strategic alignment, and trying to make decisions better. So if I try and encapsulate that in the same language that I used to talk about change in the previous 100 years, I think change management in the last 20 years has started to look at itself as an extension of product management. And I talk about product management in terms of products we try to get to customers. Change management is about making sure those products are properly shaped for the customer. Critically, in this case, change is a complex problem, complex and complicated from the Cynefin framework, which is wonderful, by the way. Do Google it if you've not come across it. Essentially, we're saying we don't actually know what the right answer is at the end. It's very intertwined with people's opinions, people's values, a complicated and stakeholder group. So what that means is the solution is subjective. The solution depends on what the people we're giving it to think of it, and it's emergent. We don't really know what the end point is going to look like until we put it in front of them. There's a great quote from Henry Ford who says, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they'd ask for faster horses. And in some ways that kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to get. People can't design the endpoint. They can't really say what value looks like until they start to see it. So anything we're doing around change management starts to become quite emergent. We have to get stuff in front of people so they can see it and they can start to feel their way towards it. So I encapsulate that as, if you look at the sort of the previous 100 years of being about how can I build Widget A better, the last 20 years has been saying how can I extract the most value from Widget A by making decisions faster than my competitor? How do I make sure that Widget A is working for my customers, and how do I make decisions faster to make sure it keeps aligned to that? So that's a kind of very quick summary through the history, in my opinion, of project management and what the last 20 years has brought to us and what we need to be thinking about as we start thinking about change management going forward. So let's think about that. So we use this particular tool here at P2 to try and think about the future. And what this tool is trying to say is really there's kind of 4 really interesting things that future approaches to project management are trying to do: enhancing effectiveness, enhancing efficiency, overcoming stress, and overcoming bias. Now I'm going to dig into each of these now. We also look at Horizon. So Horizon 1 is kind of what's here now, what can you kind of go out and buy and start doing now? And Horizon 2 is more about where do we think the future is likely to go. So let's start with enhancing effectiveness. So effectiveness for me is really all about helping people make decisions more effectively, more correctly, that are more accurate. And that's a really big ask. I mean, I think you can almost define good transformation management as the enablement of good, effective decision making as quickly as possible. In this quadrant, I tend to talk about predictive analytics, because actually one of the most powerful tools that we see coming down the line now is the ability to use things like machine learning. I'll use big data, but it's a catch-all term, but sort of some big data techniques, AI for want of a better word, to help us look at the data. The way I sort of talk about this is that, as project managers, as portfolio managers, we sit on a lot of data. And as our experience grows, we get better at looking at that data and picking out patterns for that data that tell us when things are likely to go wrong. But there's only so much data that a human can kind of consume. And as you start to get across bigger and bigger programs, it starts to become harder and harder to see the patterns and see the challenge. What predictive analytics does, and does very well, is start to look at that large sets of data and identify concerns, areas for focus. So, and I'm really committed to this, the good predictive analytics doesn't replace a good project manager or sort of 20 years experience. What it does is it enhances the ability of that project manager, that PMO manager, that portfolio manager to look across his data set and identify areas of focus to dive into. So predictive analytics is an incredibly important tool to enhance, to magnify our ability to spot patterns and know where issues are arising. Now in Horizon 1, there's already a range of cool techniques one can use. I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with cost and schedule and quantitative risk assessments or risk analysis. But there are some equally interesting tools. We use one called random forest analysis here, which basically allows you to look at big chunks of data and look for patterns in that data that relate to, and I'm going to use words, fraudulent milestone or data assessments. So for instance, I get a whole load of different milestones sent into me, and milestone assessments, i.e. red, amber, green. I can use random forest analysis to look at the environment, the factors around those. They're sent in by a particular project. They have a lot of risk associated and so on and so forth. And it will flag ones that probably are not going to hit the targets that we're expecting of them. So random forest analysis is a very, very funky little tool that you can apply over projects and large-scale portfolios. Where do I think this is going to go, though? What I think is really interesting about this is at the moment, those tools are very fragmented. It's not nowhere near a homogeneous set of tools out there. People are using different approaches and different algorithms. I think what we're going to see over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years is a standardization of the classic tools that would be used. So in the same way that I go out at the moment and use MS Project, and I'll use critical path analysis to work out what's going on, actually I think you'll find standardized tools in the predictive analytics space, and you'll find those packaged in your classic PPM tool sets. So it will be a simple case of kind of clicking the button to get the outputs. I also think there's a really interesting implication this has for the PPM community, because classically in the PPM community, we'll be talking about project managers, planners, and all these other great roles. I think we're going to start to see a predictive change data scientist role becoming more and more standard in large-scale organizations. It'll just be expected that when I'm setting up my PMO, when I'm setting up my portfolio function, I will have access to a data scientist who can help me integrate the data, analyze the data, and apply predictive analytics over the top of it. So the first quadrant we talk about is enhancing effectiveness. It's about making us better at decision making. It's about magnifying our decision making capability. And it's very much around predictive analytics becoming standard in the future. The next quadrant we like to talk about is what I call enhancing efficiency. And that essentially means allowing me to do more with less people, allowing me to oversee more change programs, allowing me to deliver more activity with less people. And then this takes us into the territory of bots. Bots a very sort of trendy term at the moment. All a bot really means is actually an automation facility. So basically any sensible bot out there is going to allow you to hook together a workflow, hook together a range of activities, dive into a load of different systems, and automate the sort of stuff that actually you usually get done manually in a project program management office or any space. Now, actually, the interesting thing I think about bots, and in fact about predictive analytics, is if you looked at the operational side of any business, so much of this stuff is already standard. If you go to a large organization, any large multinational bank, for instance, will have a lot of this stuff already operating in their operational sides. They'll be using analytics to work out fraudulent transactions, to identify fraudulent transactions, for instance. They'll be using automation to smooth the flow of activity through their banking staff, through their front end, and through their back end. But up till now, it hasn't really been applied in the change space. Now that's starting to change. So for instance, in a number of our PMOs, we use tools such as UiPath, which is open source, or Flow, which is a Microsoft tool, to automate some of the processes you've seen around risk management, around planning, around exception reporting. And it allows us to kind of get far more reaches from our PMOs than if we were using kind of individuals to do that. So that stuff is just becoming standard in terms of creation. And again, having people in your team who get this, who have the capability to start doing this stuff, is incredibly important. Probably more incitingly, though, you're starting to see a world where actually I may have these individuals sitting in a central change function, but there's no reason they can't reach out into the wider business and help that wider business automate their simple processes. So suddenly your PMO, your project function, goes from being a bottom of the line, i.e. just a cost, to a thing that's genuinely driving active value into the business by reducing costs around the business's process. So in Horizon 1, we're seeing really cool tools like UiPath and Flow starting to be used to standardize processes, starting to be used to automate processes, apologies, that have been standardized within the change function. Where do I think this is going? Well, actually, I've used the phrase Alexa for the change team on the screen there, and actually that's probably as good a summary as I can give for where I think the world's going to go. I attended the PMO conference, it must have been 2-3 years ago, and actually somebody showed off a tool where basically you phoned up a central number. You said, I'd like to see the exception reports for the last few months, please. And the tool basically created those from the central database and emailed it out. Now, actually, I've not seen that happen since, so I'm kind of wondering if that kind of slightly fell off a cliff. But it's definitely the way the world is going. When you start to get decent sets of standardized data, when you start to get really standard processes, where you start to automate that, you can guarantee you're going to go to a world where there will be a voice activated tool where you can call in and actually ask to see reports and the like. So I'm expecting the next 2, 3, 4 years to see PPM tools that are fully automated, voice activated, and sort of action on demand for reports and the like. Again, what does that mean for the change team? Well, I would really strongly recommend that actually in every change space, you're looking to find people who have familiarity with UiPath, Flow, some of these more basic automation tools. They are very, very user friendly once you know how to use them. And I think we're going to start treating them in the same way we treat Excel, we treat PowerPoint, we treat Power BI. So I think those are the really two interesting technological changes we're going to see already happening, and more so over the next few years. The other side of the dial is looking at what I think of as psychological implications. What do I mean by that? Well, we've started to understand a great deal more about how we as humans engage with change, why we fear it, why we struggle with it. And actually that's driving a huge amount of interesting thinking over how you can help people better relate to the act of change. If there's one book I'd highly recommend, it's this one, Neuroscience for Organizational Change by Hilary Scarlett, which takes a look at the science that exists at the moment around this and talks about how it could be applied in the change space. A great little book. In my head, though, I think of this in 2 quadrants. So let's look at overcoming stress, first of all. So why am I worried about stress? Well, actually, there's some really interesting stuff that shows us that stress is such a fundamental blocker to people accepting change, being ready for change, being willing to engage with change. It's essentially driven by the fear of the unknown, and actually the fear of the unknown is a really powerful motivator for us. Change often pushes people into unknown, hence people push back against it. There's also some really interesting research you'll see in the bottom left of the diagram, something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and that's basically saying that there's an optimal level of stress. Too less stress and we don't really work very hard, too much stress and we basically freeze down. So there's some really interesting thinking about the damage stress can do, the damage fear can do to any transformational change program. Why is that relevant here? Well, I think it's hugely relevant because actually one of the fundamental ways of overcoming stress and fear is communication. Communication is a fundamental role of the project manager and the PMO. And I think the more we start to engage with it and the more we understand our role is to help people know what's going to happen through communication, through clear discussions, through honest conversations, the more we're going to reduce stress, the more we're going to get people accepting of the change we're going through. So what's sitting in Horizon 1 here? Well, Horizon 1 is, I've used the word change readiness. What I essentially mean by that is we're starting to accept we can use tools to measure organizational stress, to measure organizational readiness for change, and actually take that information and use that to target our communication strategy to allow us to better manage that. So that's kind of where we are now. Where I think we're going, I use the term here, the fearless organization. And again, a wonderful book there by Amy Edmondson that talks about fearless organization, creating what they call psychological safety. And psychological safety is a term that basically says the world's quite a scary place. for people to operate really effectively, they need to be able to operate without fear. What that means is I'm able to talk about where things have gone wrong in an open and honest environment so that we can fix that. And when you start to look at a number of metrics, actually it's more and more turning out that psychological safety is the main driver behind poor organizational performance. You know, you can talk about a number of types of bureaucracy. There's a pathological bureaucracy, which is kind of the American psycho model where everyone's trying to do each other in. There's the bureaucratic kind of bureaucracy where everybody kind of is following the rules. And there's the generator of bureaucracy where actually people are working together, sharing information, excited about the job they're doing and operating in a fearless organization. That doesn't mean things don't go wrong. It means when things don't go wrong, we're comfortable talking about it, sharing learnings and getting better. I think more and more we in the change management world are going to start to see that as a fundamental part of our job, helping to create that to help better decision making, to help better continuous improvement. And overcoming bias. So overcoming bias is another very interesting area for me. Actually, as we start to understand a bit more about sort of us as humans, we realize that actually we struggle to make decisions. We struggle to make decisions effectively with a strategic view. There's a wonderful book by Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast, so talks about all the stuff we did when we were on the savannah. That basically means we aren't hugely great at managing ourselves in wide cultures and wider organizations. Classic example is the optimism bias, which basically means we are very, very poor at planning. We always think things are going to go better than they are. And actually we're going to deliver more value. Now, at the moment, we're already seeing really interesting activity that does something called reference class forecasting, which says what has the larger business done, what's change look like for the larger business, and we're going to apply that thinking to my current project management so I know what I'm likely to go over in terms of time and cost, and go under in terms of benefits. Reference class forecasting, really powerful tool we're seeing now. I think where we're going to take this to a place where we're talking about the anti-fragile portfolio, which is essentially the idea that we can build a portfolio of change that responds well to shock rather than falling off a cliff whenever anything goes wrong because it's got too heavily interlinked. It's a huge amount under that. I'd strongly recommend if you get the chance reading Nicholas Nazzim-Taleb's book, The Anti-Fragile. And there's actually some stuff on the PT website about what the anti-fragile portfolio might look like. So 4 really important quadrants, but actually, do you know what? There's something that underpins all of that, something that we talk a lot here at P2, and actually that's agility. That's actually understanding that a lot of the world we're in focuses on, a lot of the change world we're in is currently focused on this project concept. I'm going to do a project here, it's going to be that, it's going to end in this particular time. To get true agility, though, you need to move to a world where you have a product focus. You are understanding the customer view on for each of your products, which is what we call your value streams, how your organization generates value. And there's a huge number of frameworks out there. The one that we're particularly keen on here is something called SAFe, the Scaled Agile framework, which provides a structure for doing change based on the value streams in your organization in an agile way at scale. And I'm sure you're fully aware of Agile. Scaled Agile is going to be a really interesting area, and I think we're seeing more and more organizations working out how they can deliver their digital requirements in an agile fashion to help them make decisions quicker and to design things that give more customer value. So the final thing I talk about is Scaled Agile and the need to understand what that might mean in your organization. So look, that's a hugely quick canter through the future. I think there's really 5 important takeaways. I think firstly, project management to product management at scale is something we all need to understand. Are you working in the project world? Are you dealing with digital activities? We really need to understand a little bit more about product management and Scaled Agile. Automation is just going to be a basic skill of project managers alongside PowerPoint, Plan, and Excel. I genuinely believe data science is going to become a formal role within change management, and actually having someone who's a change data scientist will become really important. EQ, not IQ. It's about how we, it's emotional quotient rather than intellectual. It's about how do we help people understand what they're doing, how do we understand their stress levels, how are we sensitive to their needs, both in terms of what we're trying to build and in terms of their nervousness about it happening to them. And finally, decision-making enablement will become a formal sought-after skill. But essentially what I mean by that is so much of our job is about helping
people make decisions. And there's a real technique to that. It's about building trust around the governance board. It's about creating reports and documentation that help people see what decisions need to be made. It's about being very clear about the journey you're going. And I think actually starting to think of project management less about building widget A and more about building an organization that can deliver widget A in a way that works for the customer and works for the organization, that people can make decisions quickly and effectively. That's where the real game is going to be. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. So thank you once again for joining me today, and thank you for everyone who's joined us over the last 10 or 11 webinars. We'll be back in September with a new schedule of webinars. Like I say, we will try and come back with any questions, so if you want to phone in and ask questions, do feel free. Otherwise, all that remains to be said is thank you so much, and do have a wonderful August and summer break.